"Ah, it's you. What have you come here for, my poor fellow? Ah, things aren't looking very rosy." I plied him with questions, and he answered in short, coherent sentences. "Charleroi? Don't talk of it. Our men? Grand. A hecatomb. Then the retreat. Day and night. The Germans daren't. Ah, a nice business, isn't it? We're retreating." He told me where the regiment was, in a huge farm a long way off. He said he could take my canteen in one of his vans. As for me, I should have to manage as best I could next day to join my comrades. It would take some time to get my horses detrained, as the only platform was still being used for the vans not yet unloaded. "Thanks," I said. "Well, it's quite simple. To morrow I go straight towards the cannon. Good night." And I went off to finish my sleepless night, lying beside my horses, with my eyes fixed on the chink of the door. I waited, hour after hour, for the daylight. When dawn broke I had already got Wattrelot and a couple of railway men, who were still in the station, to bring my horse box up to the platform. The 3 horses were quickly saddled and ready to start. The freshness of the morning and the joy of feeling firm ground under their feet again made them uncommonly lively. Indeed, Wattrelot came near to feeling the effects of their good spirits somewhat uncomfortably as he was getting into the saddle. At last we started at a quick trot along a white, dusty road which led straight across the fields still bathed in shadow. I went first in the direction my friend had vaguely indicated the night before. Wattrelot followed, leading my spare horse. The horse's footsteps resounded strangely in this unknown country, where nothing else could be heard. Were we really at war? Everything seemed, on the contrary, to breathe perfect tranquillity. What a change from the feverish bustle of the station the evening before! We rode through a rich and fertile countryside. The fields stretched out one after another without end, covering the rounded flanks of the undulating ground with their stubble, dotted with stacks and golden sheaves. A few hedges and some clumps of trees broke the monotony of the landscape. Here and there farms of imposing proportions appeared among the foliage. No shots were to be heard, nor any sound of marching troops, and this made me uneasy that I began to wonder whether something had not happened during the night to shift the scene of fighting without my knowledge. But I was about to see something which would remind me, better than the noise of cannon, that the scene of strife was not far off. As the daylight became gradually brighter, we distinguished figures moving round some straw stacks, folks who had collected there to pass the night sheltered as much as possible from the cold and the morning dew. I thought they were soldiers who had lost touch with their regiments and had taken their brief night's rest in the open air, but I soon saw my mistake. As by enchantment, as soon as the first rays of the sun appeared, the sleepers got up, and I saw that they were civilians, mostly women and children. They were the unfortunate country folk who had fled before the barbarian hordes. They had preferred to forsake their homes, to leave them to the invader, rather than fall into their hands. They had fled carrying with them the most precious things they possessed. They had come away not knowing where they would stop, nor where they could pass the night, and as soon as the twilight came and found them exhausted on the interminable roads, they had dropped down by the stacks grateful for a humble bed of straw. There they had stretched their aching limbs. The mothers had carefully made up little beds for their babies. Families had nestled closely together, and often whole villages had gathered in the same fields and around the same stacks. And when the daylight appeared they had got up hurriedly, and the roads were already crowded with mournful pilgrims seeking refuge further and further inland. I must confess that I had not expected to see such a sight. It made my heart ache. I was seized with a fury, and longed to be able to rush upon the enemy, drive him back across the frontier, and restore the dwellings forsaken by these poor folks. What human being, however cold-hearted, could help feeling deep pity at the sight of these poor, weak and inoffensive creatures fleeing before invasion? There were pitiable sights on every hand. A mother pushing a perambulator containing several small children, whilst 5 or 6 others were hanging on to her dress or trotting along behind her. Poor invalids, dragged, pushed, carried by all means possible, sooner than be left in the hands of the Prussians. Old men helped along by boys, infants carried by old men. and as they passed they all cast a look of distress at the officer who rode quickly by, averting his eyes. I thought I saw reproach in those glances. They seemed to say to me, "Why haven't you been able to defend us? Why have you let them come into our country? See how we are suffering. Look at our little children who cannot walk any further. Where are we to go now that by your fault we have left the homes of our childhood and of our fathers and of our fathers' fathers? Is that what war is?" I urged my horse to get them out of sight and to reach the fighting line as quickly as I could. Suddenly the report of a gun sounded straight in front of me. Further off a few rifle shots were audible, and then guns again, accompanied by concentrated rifle fire. A kind of shiver passed through my whole body. My first battle! I was going to take part in my first battle! I felt really mad and intoxicated at the thought of at last realising the dream of my life. But other feelings were mingled with it. I reflected, what effect will it have upon me? I expect I shall come into the middle of the fight when I get over that ridge. Shall I duck my head when I hear the bullets whistling and the shrapnel bursting around me? I am determined to play the man. I know Wattrelot is close by, trotting behind me. He mustn't see the least symptom of nervousness in me. The noise of the guns became louder. By the way, I wonder what Wattrelot feels like. I turned to look at him and found his face a bit pale, but directly he saw me glance at his blue North Country eyes, his face lit up with a broad smile. "Here we are, sir." "Yes, Wattrelot, here we are. I'm sure you don't know what fear is." "Oh, no, sir." "That's all right. Forward, then. To the guns." We passed through a hamlet full of waggons and motors. Some orderlies were loading them up with rations and boxes. On one of these I happened to see the number of my own army corps. "I'm all right, then," thought I, and turned to an adjutant of the Army Service Corps who was superintending the work. "Do you know where the staff of the corps is?" I asked. The man shrugged his shoulders to show that he didn't, and he didn't care. What did it matter to him? His job was to get the goods loaded, forget nothing, and then to go to his appointed post, where he would have to wait for further orders to unload his stuff in the evening. He had enough to do. What did anything else matter to him? However, he pointed in a vague manner. "They went over there." Off I started again, over the wide undulating plain. The noise of the cannonade became louder and louder, and I now perceived traces of the work of death. At a turning of the road there were a couple of dead horses that had been dragged into a ditch. I cannot say how painful the sight was to me. Apparently a dead horse at the seat of war is a trifle, and no doubt I should very soon see it with indifference. But these were the first I had seen, and I could not help casting a glance of pity at them, poor beasts. A month before they had been showing off their fine points in the well-kept stables of the artillery barracks. When I saw them their stiffened corpses bore traces of all their sufferings. The harness had rubbed great sores in their flesh in more than one place. Their glazed eyes seemed to be still appealing for pity. They had fallen down exhausted, finding it impossible to keep up with their fellows. They had been quickly unharnessed so as not to block up the road, and had been dragged to the sunburnt grass, and there it was no doubt the death agony that had already lasted for some hours had come to an end. We went on, and in the distance, here and there on the plain, which now stretched before us for miles, we saw more of them. I wondered how it was that so many horses had fallen in so short a time. It was not a month since mobilisation had been ordered, and hardly 10 days since operations had begun. What a huge effort, then, the army must already have made! But I soon forgot the poor beasts, for we were nearing the scene of the struggle. Behind the shelter of every swell in the ground were ammunition waggons. I went up to one of these and was astonished at what I saw. The limbers, which are always so smart in the barrack yard, with their grey paint, were covered with a thick coating of dust or hardened mud. The horses, dirty and thin, seemed ready to drop. Their necks were covered with sores, and they were hanging their heads to eat, but seemed not to have the strength enough to take up their food. Drivers and non-commissioned officers were sprawling about, sleeping heavily. Their cadaverous faces, beards of a week's growth, and drawn features showed even in their sleep how exhausted they were. I could hardly recognise the original colour of their dingy uniforms under the accumulation of stains and dust. It was now 8 o'clock in the morning. The sunshine was beating hot upon the